Good morning, everybody, and welcome to those present and those online. You'll notice this morning that our microphone system is significantly enhanced, so it's probably better to keep it further away rather than closer. So the hearing today is part of the process of hearing submissions to the proposed district plan, and today we're looking at the submissions lodged to Natural Features and Landscape chapter, and also consider responses to the draft Natural Character chapter. My name's Keith Ovell, and I'm the chair of the District Plan Hearings panel. Other panel members with us is Cliff Bolger to my left, far right Maria Bartlett, and next to me Glenys Dixon. We've read all the pre-circulated material and preparing for today, and we don't need that reread, but we do ask for a brief introduction summarising the main points, and then we'll ask questions. We've come with an open mind on all issues, but in order to seek full understanding of the position of submitters and the advice being given to us, we will be asking a series of questions, and those questions should not be seen as an indication of our position on any issues. In terms of proceedings today, we'll hear from the advisors to the hearing panel. We've got Miska Ben Heedy, who's the planner, Mike Moore, landscape architect, and Shelley Chadwick, legal counsel. Not too sure what order you're going to go in, but that's up to you. Then we'll be hearing remotely from Transpower, and they're due to speak at 10:15. Stony Creek, there's Brett Highstead, Claire Perkins, and we have some evidence from Ben Espy. And hopefully Ben's going to be here or online.
Yeah, he's going to join us on the phone. He's going to be about 10.
Right, excellent, thank you. And then after lunch, Wantwood Station, we've got Coral McLeod set down for 1:30. We may then, or very likely, have more questions to advisors. So just a reminder, the hearing is streaming live on the Council's Facebook page and is available for viewing at any time, and the panel, when it's deliberating, may review the recording. We also want to take the opportunity of thanking the representatives of Stony Creek, Wantwood Station and the Council for the extensive time and effort given to work together to present to the hearings panel an agreed framework to apply to the Hokonui Hills outstanding natural landscape. Your input has been extremely useful in working towards a sound, pragmatic outcome. Health and safety issues, all those present know that in the event of an emergency, listen to your crew. Our meeting space is on the footpath outside the front of the building if we have to evacuate, and everyone knows where the toilets are, which are directly through behind me through the corridor. So handing over to the council advisors, and we will make a start. Thank you. Sorry, just before you do, I talked about the submitters who are present. One that we don't have present is the Federated Farmers, and I just want to highlight that the panel does have some questions we'd like to put to Federated Farmers, so we're looking for some advice as to the best way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I just start on the tidy ups, because I'm not the star of the show here, I'll hand over to Mike and Mishka pretty quickly after this. So the first tidy up was Fed Farmers, and perhaps offering to have a dialogue with them about where we could potentially offer them an opportunity to come to another hearing, perhaps, to present, to support their evidence that they've already filed. So there's probably three options. One might be that questions are delivered in writing for them to respond to. For me, that would seem the least preferable. Other options include the week of the 24th, which is currently the eco hearing. Fed Farmers does have evidence provided already for that, so I would anticipate they're coming then. So it could be tacked onto the end of that. The third option is also at the wrap-up hearing. So perhaps if I offer those alternatives to Fed Farmers and then present and can email the hearing administrator to confirm what a proposed resolution for that is.
If we can help, need to turn off.
Oh.
So agreed, our preference is not to do it in writing. In person we see as appropriate, and there is some overlap between the issues we're talking about today and some of the biodiversity issues. So we see the most logical time of doing it is at the time of that hearing in 2 weeks. So if that's able to be set up, that would be appreciated.
We will just have to wrangle a little bit. Mishka's has other plans, so that's fine. That's part of what I can manage in the background. I can manage in the background. So yeah, Mishka's preference would be online. She's going to be up north in the land of the others. The other tidy up I had also related to fed farmers, and I've raised a scope issue, which for me seemed a little bit confusing, and perhaps that's something else that I can clarify with them, because I did think I'd missed a couple of points in the 32AA, which perhaps would have clarified where the policies had been drawn from. So I can take that up in the background with them and see if they want to pursue that when they do come at the ECO hearing.
Can we just take a 30-second break, because your supplementary evidence that came in late I've left on the table in the other room.
Good morning. Myself and Mike will probably be answering the bulk of the questions today. Obviously, I take all the 42A, the 32AA, and the supplementary evidence in the various chapters as read. However, it might be useful to give a brief overview of the working group and the changes made to the natural features and landscapes chapter, as well as the development of the natural character chapter. So, landscape first. So through the submissions process, it became obvious that the natural features and landscape chapter as notified was not workable for the existing farms that were in the Hokonui Hills. So with Stony Creek, and we have Claire in the audience representing Stony Creek today, as well as Wantwood Station, we developed what became known as the working group, to try and find a balance between protecting the landscape values of the Hokonui Hills and providing for the existing farming and to have those everyday sort of farming activities provided for within that chapter. Myself and Mr. Mike Moore here, who's a landscape architect based in Dunedin but does a lot of work in Southland and particularly in the Gore district, along with Matt Heel, who was representing the ecosystems chapter. We're representing the council, and then Stony Creek had Claire Perkins, who's in the audience, as their planner, Ben Espy as their landscape architect, and Glenn, whose last name has briefly escaped me, representing them as their ecologists. So we had a number of meetings, and obviously farm managers as well. Brett Heisted was involved from Stony Creek. So we had a number of workshops to work through the various rules to attempt to find that balance, and we were able to come up with a consensus, which included the mapped extent of the Hokonui Hills ONL, which both the landscape architects agreed was appropriate. In terms of the actual boundaries of the ONL, there was some small changes where on the western extent this was brought in slightly. Through the working group, Mr. Moore was able to do some site visits, and he sort of agreed that that was probably a little bit too far into the otherwise rural area of the district, so he tweaked that boundary. But other than that, both the landscape architects were able to agree that the Hokonui Hills outstanding natural landscape was outstanding and should remain that way. However, within those boundaries, it was found that there were some more sensitive elements from a landscape perspective and less. So we were able to, you can see it behind you on the whiteboard, the areas in yellow were considered less visually sensitive while still within the outstanding natural landscape. And then the red lines, those represent the ridge lines, which are considered quite sensitive. So anything that's not yellow or red just defaults to the outstanding natural landscape rules. Anything within the yellow area is the lower sensitivity area, which is then reflected in the rules. And then the red ridge lines, we've needed to be quite conservative with the activities that should be enabled to happen there. So from that map, we then fell into our provisions to make sure that those were fit for purpose for everyday farming operations, while also making sure the landscape values were protected. So we worked quite hard and I think quite constructively to come up with some updated provisions. Probably the rule that you'll hear the most about today is Rule, I think, 3, relating to land disturbance and earthworks. As I've outlined in my 42A and then reiterated in my supplementary evidence, this differs from the current recommendation for the earthworks rules for district-wide. Now, I'm not suggesting that the earthworks provisions in an outstanding natural landscape should be higher than elsewhere in the district. However, we've put quite a bit of thought into considering the landscape elements only for these earthworks rules and how we can push to allow the most to ensure that farming operations can continue while still protecting the landscape values. And there's quite a bit of that's very context driven, with the Hokonui Hills being quite separated from public viewing areas in terms of distance, while still being quite visually prominent within the district. So this setting has only considered landscape aspects, and at the time of drafting, the recommendation had not been to extend earthworks provisions district-wide into overlays. I understand that has now changed. However, what the panel lands on is still a little bit of an unknown. So this rule at the moment does cross-reference to some earthworks standards to make sure that accidental discovery is considered, and a few other things in there that you can see in Rule 3. If the panel is of a mind to extend the earthworks provisions district-wide, then those standards are no longer necessary because they'll apply anyway under the earthworks plan. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be questions on that later on anyway. And then the development of the natural character chapter. This came from a minute from the panel and was developed accordingly. Essentially, this doesn't introduce anything new into the plan. It takes the settings for the management of natural character were already integrated into the underlying zones with river and stream setbacks, and at the time the sort of obs and poles for it were managed under the natural features and landscapes chapter. So the new natural character chapter draws on those objectives and policies from the natural features and landscapes chapter, but puts it into a bespoke chapter with its own appendix describing natural character. This was developed quite closely with Mr. Mike Moore to ensure that those settings were right, and through that process we did a little bit of a rethink of the use of the term high natural character and determined that this had essentially been used initially as the Mataura River. It's important for a number of reasons. It's a water conservation order, it's a statutory acknowledgement area. It feeds into the Mataura Falls, which are identified as an outstanding natural feature, but it didn't make the cut to be an outstanding natural feature by itself. So this, and in lieu of the district having not introduced high amenity, visual amenity landscapes or features into the district, we thought a high natural character feature was appropriate at the time. However, having been able to delve into this further, there's not really a statutory precedent for using the term high natural feature outside of a coastal environment, and it also suggests that we've done a district-wide ranking undertaking and determined that the Mataura River has a higher natural character than any other river and stream in the district, which is incorrect. So that was part of the reason that we decided that we're just referring to high natural character in general, but the Mataura River has not been singled out, while acknowledging that it has other aspects to it, like the Water Conservation Order. So nothing's really changed on the ground in terms with the introduction of a natural character chapter. It's just more intuitive for plan users and make a little bit more directive. And that's it for me at this stage. Mike, I'm not sure if you want to say anything, otherwise wait for questions.
Technology. I hadn't prepared anything to say in particular, just to say good morning to you all, and I'm here to answer questions, but yeah, I think Mishka's really covered the overview, so I won't take any more of your time.
Mishka, would you just like to reiterate what you said about how you rank the Mataura River in relation to other water bodies within the district?
Yeah, we haven't, essentially. So previously, the way that it had been incorporated into the plan, it could have been assumed that we had, but that hasn't been undertaken, and I think it wouldn't be commiserate to the level of the development pressure to undertake that work. It would, be weeks and weeks of Mike trudging through every river and stream in the district, and we're just not seeing the development pressure that would suggest that's required. And I'm just not sure the benefit would then be realised necessarily above and beyond what we're already suggesting in terms of the management.
Could that be interpreted as the panel then has to consider development around all the tributaries across the district equally with what they consider the... No, you're nodding your head.
Sorry. This has been discussed quite a bit in the rural chapter already, so we're not suggesting anything more than what's already been introduced in the plan with the river and stream setbacks. So that has already been characterised into higher order, lower order streams as sort of a broad way of doing that. So no, it's not our recommendation that's considered further.
That answers my question, thank you.
Just at some point, we've got the plans up the back here, and it shows the Stony Creek paddock boundaries. It would be good to have the Wentworth boundary shown on that as well, if we can. Wentwood, yes. And if we're having a break, if people at the back are able to help, just so we've got an understanding. Okay, panel members.
So I've got some questions arising for Mr. Moore, but I'm quite happy to let others go first. Do you think I've got my microphone too close, or is that about right? Okay. Nobody else wants to go first? Okay, so I think since we were just on the river, I wanted to hear from you. We just heard that from the planner that the Mataura River didn't quite make the cut for an ONF, and so I'm presuming that was using the RPS criteria for assessment. Can you highlight for me where the river fell down in terms of its consideration as an ONF? Like the main stem, I guess I'm talking about the dominant form of the main stem, because my reason for asking is that it does have a dominant presence as it moves through the district, and so I'm just wanting to hear from you if you could pinpoint for me where it sort of didn't quite make the cut.
Yes, so in terms of landscape, which is what you're talking about, outstanding natural feature, the assessment criteria that are now generally used cover physical attributes, perceptual attributes, and associative. And using that list of criteria, it would be high in associative because of the cultural values. Physical, it's been very modified, and perceptual would be lower as well because of the modification. So it would be almost there, but I didn't. In my opinion, a better way to do it is to go under Section 6A rather than Section 6B of the RMA, which is where natural character is also a matter of national importance and manage it that way.
Yeah, so I can see that's where things have sort of settled out. I was just quite interested in exploring the difference between, I guess, now we've got the effectively equal treatment aside from the lower and higher order stream element. And I guess I was thinking of the landscape element distinctly from the 6A natural character river margins, and I just wanted to be sure that, and I'll explain why I wanted to test this with you, because following all of the landscape evidence on the Hokonui Hills, there's a lot of recognition of it being a highly modified landscape in terms of the imprint of human activity over a really long period of time is very evident and present, and that's been accommodated in relation to the Hokonui Hills ONL, and in fact has been an important factor in the working group considerations for this ONL, and that I did pick up from the landscape experts that this ONL is a bit different to others in that way because it has been highly modified in the presence of human activity as part of the interaction with it. And so then when I took that knowledge and I looked at the Mataura River, I thought, I don't understand why it's different. I don't understand why its level of modification or those perceptual factors would discount it if we've sort of allowed for that in relation to this other ONL. And I guess, and I'm probably not suggesting ONL in relation to the Mataura River. I was wondering why it wasn't in ONF. You know, you've got the Mataura Falls that are also highly modified, but really, you know, there's a lot going on there that's elevated them in. And I just was struggling to see why, you know, that landform of the river itself, which is, it does have this relationship with natural character, but it's not entirely dependent on natural character, I thought. So if you could just help me with that. I was leaning towards ONF really, and wondering why it didn't hit ONF perhaps rather than ONL.
Sure. In the end, it is a subjective assessment, and it could have been handled that way, I guess. In my assessment, I see outstanding as a pretty high bar, and I think, you know, so the falls are definitely a significant place in terms of cultural values, as I know the whole river is generally, but there's a particular significance there. And a feature, I mean the river's a feature, but the falls are a feature within the feature, if you know what I mean. So that was, I think, was appropriate to highlight them as a ONF. I think you can do this different ways. There's different layers of value that apply to the river. So there's landscape, there's natural character, and there's cultural mana whenua type values as well.
Can I just check, because I think this is really interesting that you just said that, because what I was picking up was that natural character is confining itself, you know, like the cultural elements aren't there and when you're thinking about natural character, but are there in those associative factors associated with landscape. So there seem to be, to me, a fairly, like what you were saying around the high associative value, and particularly when you bring in this statutory acknowledgement, it seemed to me like there was quite a good, you know, elevated matter there. So am I right in thinking that the cultural element, so you just listed the three, but actually the cultural element is part of a landscape assessment? Yeah.
Yes, that's the difference between natural character and landscape assessment, that landscape is more encompassing and includes the cultural element. So, you know, it does have cultural landscape values. The overall assessment of all the physical, perceptual and associative led me to believe that it was not quite outstanding.
So I picked that up nice and clearly, and I'll let you know why I'm concerned, because I think that appendix where we've deleted all of the text that's describing the values and then the ways in which those values can be impacted, to me that's quite a big loss, because it's got some
Just trying to avoid the feedback.
yeah, I don't know. See if that makes any difference. Is that good? Okay, fabulous. Yeah, so I was concerned that we were actually losing some valuable guidance in the plan around what values to consider and the impacts that might arise, and that we're losing maybe the benefit of having the complementary provisions of the natural character in our chapters working together. So I guess that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I am a little bit siloed in my understanding of how the district plan is fitting together. I'm looking at natural character and landscape, but I'm assuming that somewhere there'll also be values, mana whenua values for the river that are going to be coming into it somehow, and maybe Mishka could help me out with this, but because they definitely are important, as you say. But my assessment was, when I had to make that, when we're talking about, in landscape, we're talking about one level, which is outstanding. We're not in this district plan talking about a second tier level. You could make the case that it's outstanding, but I was not, you know, it was on the cusp, I suppose, but I felt, and overall, it didn't do it for me.
Yeah, so that on the cuspness, I think, is what I was also picking up. And why I thought it might be worth revisiting in a sense of thinking about the values that might require protection that we and how they are going to be protected, and I guess I am thinking about not just natural character values but whatever the landscape values might be. And I'm just going to, this might get back to the planner, but I'm just going to pull down, I might change that over again. I've lost the appendix now, haven't I? I'm looking at the wrong one. Oh, I've lost appendix 5. But, you know, there's a lot in there, including what we've got for the Hokanui Hills, is that list of threats and how we manage it. That those are the things that we're trying to manage. It's probably a planner question, but I guess when you're thinking about the kinds of things that can impact on landscape, maybe that's what you might be able to offer here. So thinking of management of a main stem river as a landscape item, can you, in your experience, do you have other examples to draw from where that has occurred, where a main stem river has been identified as in ONF or ONL, and what then was the additional management to protect that?
Yes, there definitely are rivers that have that status. For example, I think the Rakaia in Canterbury would be one. And I know that Waitaki are talking about, not yet, but probably will be, the Waitaki River will be outstanding, probably, in their district plan. And the values that, and what that would add in terms of over and above natural character would be the cultural values. However, I think a lot of the cultural values do come back to the natural as well, that if you manage the natural well, you are also covering a lot of the concerns that would be under the cultural values. So I think there's a real overlap. The other thing just to mention, you've said that this, like the Hokanui say, are a bit of an outlier in terms of their cultural or their modification. I don't really agree with that. I think there's a lot of outstanding landscapes in New Zealand which are in that category, and particularly, like where I'm from in Dunedin, for example, Otago Peninsula would be a similar sort of a thing. So it's not that the Hokanuis is different in particular to the difference between the Hokanui Hills and this river is just one of that assessment, the quality difference between all the assessment factors. So, yeah.
Mike, I've got another question. So you're viewing the Mataura River in the context of all rivers throughout New Zealand, and would it be fair to say that all rivers in New Zealand are culturally significant, not just Mataura?
Probably, yes.
So while they might be culturally significant, that doesn't necessarily mean they're as an outstanding natural feature. Right, so the two things can exist or not exist in tandem.
Yes, the cultural significance comes into the value assessment, but there's as I say, there's the three, from a landscape assessment point of view, there's physical, perceptual and associative, and the cultural element that comes under the associative category. Generally, you're right, most rivers in New Zealand will have they'll have value in that way, but it comes down to the overall assessment of the values in those three categories. Yep.
Good morning, Mr. Moore. In your evidence 57, we talk about the Catlin syncline, the Southland syncline. I was wondering, you say that their values are not assessed as outstanding. Can you clarify how you come to that decision?
I've got two briefs of evidence. It's the one on natural landscapes? Yes. So 57. Oh, so this is dealing with the Ravinia Johnstons. Yes, yes. Sure. So the Southland Syncline feature runs through the Hokanuis and across the river right through to Nugget Point. Yeah, so there's obviously that part of the syncline is in Gore District. So there were the strike ridges there had high perceptual values in my assessment. They weren't particularly notable in terms of the geopreservation inventory, which is the inventory of important landforms that I forget the organisation, but it's the scientific community, the geological community, they have this inventory which identifies sites throughout New Zealand. Hokanui Hills was particularly identified as a really good example of the syncline. The strike ridges to the east weren't. I think they've still got values, but they didn't quite come to the same level as the Hokanuis in that way. There wasn't the bush cover the same as that. So if there had been a level, if this district plan had been set up to have amenity landscapes or significant natural landscapes at a second tier, I think we'd be talking about them. But they were, that, as I say, outstanding is a high bar, and I think, in my assessment, there was only really the visual side of it, and I didn't see other values to back that up in physical or associative categories. So my recommendation was to not say they were outstanding.
So if there was a second tier, you would consider that would come into that category, because it is quite the visual aspect of it for Gore in itself is quite sufficient, quite.
I think that we'd definitely be wanting to look at that as a second tier landscape and discuss it with the community, obviously. But that would be, definitely be a recommendation to be bringing that forward as a potential candidate for a VAL or whatever you call it.
In reading the reports, the VALs weren't included because it was preempting changes that were forecast to the RMA, which have not happened. And I guess that's the danger of trying to anticipate things that may or may not happen. While we're looking at your report, on your recommendation, there's a rule that's been included as part of Rule 3 in Clause 4, where it provides for following land disturbance, then the area needs to be regrassed to achieve 80% coverage by the end of the next growing season. So if it doesn't achieve 80% by the next growing season, in terms of the rule, it requires a resource consent. Now, is that approach the sensible approach, practical approach?
Yeah, that was discussed a lot, and that clause was considered particularly important to provide for the level of earthworks and land disturbance that the farmers needed. We received quite a bit of assurance from the farm manager at Stony Creek that is achievable, and it just becomes a monitoring and enforcement issue if it's not. It would be the same as, if they decide to cut into stone and therefore can't achieve that, then they're breaching a rule in the district plan, and it becomes like any other breach. That part it does hinge on the landscape. Well, Mike can probably weigh in here, but without that, it becomes we're a lot less comfortable with that rule. So it is very important. I understand what you mean in terms of it then becomes a bit of a retrospective resource consent, which is not ideal, but that's sort of the only way we could really think of doing it, because you can't do that first. You need to do the cut first.
I guess from an enforcement point of view, the reality is that council will say plant it out again and then wait 12 months. While I'm looking at some of those rules, you've highlighted in your supplementary evidence that a number of rules have a category of lower sensitivity areas and then all other areas, and you've suggested that maybe it should be all other areas in the outstanding landscape. Alternative B, Mike Moore's report talks about lower sensitivity areas and higher sensitivity areas. From my perspective, it makes sense to actually use those terms, higher sensitivity area rather than all other areas.
Yeah, that was discussed a lot. It was probably my idea to just refer to the ONL more generally, because if it wasn't in the lower sensitive areas, then it's just in the ONL. But I'm comfortable with that option as well. It was just trying to simplify things, but if you think it's confusing I don't think that practically makes it in terms of the rules still work. So I'd be comfortable with that suggestion if that's what the panel wanted to do.
Another wee rule one is in terms of Rule 2, where there is reference to species that aren't pest plant identified in any regional pest management plan or the Biosecurity Act. The Biosecurity Act doesn't actually identify plants. What does is the National Pest Management Plan. So I guess the starting point is that if that clause is there, it should be referring to not a pest plant identified in any national or regional pest management plan. But my question is that if you want to plant a species in those plans, according to the district plan, it's a restricted discretionary activity, whereas in fact it's a prohibited activity. So two options. It's either listed as prohibited activity if you want to plant them, or there is a note or some other form that says the pest management plans actually dictate that there are species you're not allowed to plant.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that suggestion. I guess if it's prohibited anyway, then it's prohibited anyway. It's just doubling up in the district plan. But yeah, I have no issue with making that clear somewhere in the rule.
There is a further reason for it, and that is the legal advice that we've had is that if you're making reference to another plan, it should be which year that plan is. So it seems easier to not have reference to the plans at all in the rule. Following part of that rule, talking about the all other areas, has a clause that hasn't changed, but I have difficulty in the way it's worded. It refers to tree planting for restoration or hazard prevention. Now, I'm not too sure if we can actually prevent hazards. We can manage them.
That clause really is designed to be about riparian planting. So if you've got more planting in a riparian area, then I guess that can mitigate flooding. It can't prevent flooding, but it can potentially lessen the effects of flooding.
So should we be looking at another word other than prevention? And it's a minor matter, so it's not changing.
I think replacing prevention with management could probably do the trick there.
I guess a question for Mike Moore. Are you aware in your recommendation that woodlots are provided for as a restricted discretionary activity that in the report for the rural submissions, there's a recommendation that woodlots be limited to an area of 1 hectare. Are you happy with that also being here? Because the way the recommendation has been made, it is a condition on a woodlot activity in the rural zone, not part of the definition of woodlot. So for consistency, if we're going to provide for woodlots in this area, are you comfortable with it having a 1 hectare maximum size?
Yes, that's appropriate.
I found Appendix 5 that's been deleted, and it did have some useful hints as to what might need to be managed from a landscape sense. So you've left us with a situation because of the Mataura River just not quite making it, sort of on the cusp of making it but not making it as an ONF. Those considerations at the moment disappear, and so this is probably a planning question, but it was just to let you know that I did find Appendix 5 and it did have some clear landscape threats, and they do look to me like landscape threats, not just natural character threats. So and also, just wanted to check, do we have your assessment, you know, your full assessment report on the Mataura River to inform us?
It's certainly been, and it's certainly there in the record. I'm not sure what you've got in front of you now, but
yes, that was provided with the original 32A, so it's in that section of the Gore District Gore the website. Just on the note about Appendix 5 and the loss of that information in relation to the Mataura River, there is now Appendix 6, which does provide a lot of that useful information. I take your point about some of those cultural elements that have potentially been sort of lost through that process. I guess there is the SASM chapter, and I know that's very much up in the air at the moment. But potentially, if it's found that that information is not sufficiently provided through SASM or the updated Appendix 6, then it might be something that could be discussed in the wrap-up hearing, just to make sure we're not losing that information, because I agree it is useful to inform plan users.
Yeah, and to me it was both the values element, or like describing what this thing is in terms of the landform, but also, you know, there are some specific landscape threats sitting there that have been identified. So, and they're not necessarily just dependent on being cultural elements. So that's one feeder, obviously quite an important one. But there's actually some landscape threats listed, and to me that was the combination of having the landform described and its values and the threats to those values and the things that you want to manage because of that, to me was the bit that we were losing. Yeah.
And just to clarify, you're concerned that those threats and descriptions have not made it through to Appendix 6 with the natural character appendix? That was the intent of the appendix, but if there's elements that you believe are missing, it would be good to know.
Okay, so that's what we need to cover off. Yeah, thank you. So I did have, in relation to Mr. Moore's, he's got in his paragraph 69, he's talking about the fossil, I've just got to find it. The geoheritage fossil sites, 68, 69. And I guess what I wanted to ask Mr. Moore is, do you think there is a gap in the plan in terms of protection of these as natural features? Yeah, and are you identifying them in this part of your report as a specific response to the SDC submission, i.e. that would give us scope to think about them, and is there a gap? Are they protected?
Yeah, I think that they are valid things for the district plan to be protecting. And in my initial assessment, some of them that had more than just scientific interest were considered as well, such as Landslip Hill, for example. But I think in general, it would be hopefully not too hard for the district, if you wanted to protect them, because they're all mapped and everything, and they're all available. The information's there about them. You could probably quite easily have some sort of a provision that recognised those values and protected them.
Yeah, that was one of my other questions. Are they easy to map? Yeah. And so, right, so they're worthy of protection. They don't. Are they in the same category as the Mataura River as not meeting the outstanding natural feature category? So they'd have to be managed some other way.
Okay, so the geoheritage features, some of them are very one-dimensional, like their fossil sites. So their scientific interest. There's no other category of value. Some of them, though, are more than that, and definitely have, say, visual interest and things as well. So whether they fit as outstanding natural features with all the other landscape things is a bit of an issue. I think because there's a category of information out there that you could just tap into, which is geoheritage, the geopreservation sites. If you wanted to, you could use that and have some sort of provisions that recognise them and made sure their values weren't damaged or were protected. I'm not a planner, sorry, but that information is there and it's mapped.
So that's something we can pick up with the planner and work out where would you put geopreservation sites? Where do they belong?
This was discussed quite a bit during the workshops, Glenys and Keith might remember. Where they would sit, I believe, if they met the sort of criteria with further investigation, would be value amenity landscapes, so VAL landscapes. So this was discussed throughout the workshop whether or not we introduce this new category into the district. So Gore currently does not have any VALs. Keith, whether previous to this, the ODP, whether they did, you might be able to weigh in. But at the time, as Keith mentioned earlier, RMA amendments were looking to remove the reference to amenity. So that formed part of the reason why we didn't explore this further, because we'd be introducing a new landscape, amenity landscape, into the district that previously didn't have them, and we didn't want to then rip them out as soon as RMA reform came back in. Obviously, RMA reform was a big old question mark now. We don't know if amenity will be removed from the future, and I don't think it's appropriate to speculate. As Keith said, we probably erred a little bit in speculating in the first place. However, that wasn't the only reason. So, as Mike's mentioned previously, there are a number of features throughout the region and district that are within this geopreservation index. That geopreservation index makes it very clear that inclusion within that index is not enough of a reason for inclusion as a VAL or an outstanding natural feature. Further investigation needs to happen. We discussed that with the council and through the workshop process, and it was decided that we would not continue that further investigation. Partly because of where RM reform was heading, but also at the time it was considered that the actual threat to these geopreservation sites there wasn't really a threat to them, and that the underlying sort of rural zone, because they're predominantly in rural areas, would provide some level of protection. So I think, Mike, feel free to weigh in, and I am sort of scratching the back of my memory a little bit, but plantation forestry was thought to be something that could, you're visually obscuring these geopreservation sites, and that is already managed through the district plan, and that was sort of considered appropriate without going into further investigative detail. So I guess that's where our recommendation sits at the moment. However, when Mike does say they're mapped, to clarify, they are not mapped in the district plan, they're mapped in the geopreservation index. Shelley, I don't know if you've got some thoughts that we might need to do some scope investigation in terms of if someone had one of these sites on their land, if they could theoretically think that the SDC submission could impact them and whether or not they would have then further submitted, but that's probably out of my realm of expertise.
Okay, so here's what
Mike was going to add to it.
was he? Oh,
Oh.
sorry.
I just thought one threat that should be mentioned would be, say, quarry, that's all.
So this is what's been on my mind, because I thought, yes, forestry from a visual perspective, but I was also thinking about quarrying and earthworks. Now we've talked this morning about three things that were part of my question. So what Commissioner Dixon was raising in terms of those VALs that have dropped away on the other side, the Mataura River and these geosites. I guess what I want to know is that because values have been identified for these three elements, none of which make the cut for this chapter, I want to be certain that the provisions in the plan are honed in enough to pick up on this information that exists and provide the necessary protections. So you've already pointed us towards the rural zone provision. So this was one of the things I wanted to just test is, should we be thinking about whether there might be something missing in the rural zone provisions in relation to the geopreservation sites, which might be in a similar category to the archaeological sites that we're trying to work out how to manage. And that the visual element of the open, east side is appropriately protected through the rural zone provisions. I guess I'd be really comfortable seeing an assessment that each of these elements that are dropping away from this chapter, the values that we know exist and have been identified, are being picked up. Yeah. And maybe the information layer approach that's been talked about in relation to the archaeological layer, archaeological stuff is also relevant to the geopreservation material, maybe.
Yes, no problem. Off the top of my head, we do have accidental discovery protocol throughout the, for instance, in quarries. But as you said, it might be more appropriate to provide a more comprehensive report on how these aspects will be managed or if there are any gaps.
We can come back after deliberations if we see that as something we want to follow up on. Can I just change tack for a moment? Ms. Skerr, in your report, when I look at policy 3, the word critical has come out of infrastructure. Now, critical infrastructure appears 14 times in the district plan, has a definition, and there seems to be a pattern of taking out the word critical when describing infrastructure. And looking at the nesting table, critical infrastructure is a subset of infrastructure. So looking at the big picture for the whole plan, is the recommendation that we should only be referring to infrastructure, or are there times when critical infrastructure is significant?
I think there are times where it's useful to reference critical infrastructure as a subset. In terms of the natural features and landscapes chapter, that was, I think it was in response to a doc submission, though I don't believe Transpower has an issue with that amendment, they've been quite active in their submissions, but that was on purpose because it was sort of thought that that then leaves out infrastructure more generally and it should be included within that policy. But in terms of where it's appropriate to use critical infrastructure as opposed to infrastructure, probably in terms of the protection of critical infrastructure, it's useful. And there are instances where, you know, there might be a place where critical infrastructure is more suitable because it's really important, but infrastructure generally might be best placed somewhere else.
Can you please have a look, and we'll come back to it later, at the two definitions that are in the plan? The infrastructure one is the RMA definition. The critical infrastructure is a bespoke one for the Gore plan. Are there any differences between the two, I guess is where my question's heading. And we can come back to that.
I just need to pick up on your answer there, and I think it relates to the energy and infrastructure hearing that we had, and this idea of protecting critical infrastructure and where that comes from, i.e. we've got some very clear signals from higher order instruments and the RMA to protect Section 6 matters. So I'm just highlighting to you, I just heard that in your language again, this idea of protecting critical infrastructure. I think possibly, and I want to just tease this out with you a little bit, is it that we might be wanting to provide pathways for critical infrastructure where it's interacting with Section 6 matters in a way that protects those Section 6 matters whilst recognising the significant benefits of critical infrastructure, rather than protecting critical infrastructure, because I don't see any higher order instrument that's telling me to protect critical infrastructure.
Yes, no, I agree. Sorry, my term of using protect was more colloquial than statutory in that instance. I'm probably referring to reverse sensitivity matters more generally with critical infrastructure rather than protecting it as a matter of importance under the RMA. I agree with your first statement there that, yeah.
Rule 6 deals with Indigenous vegetation clearance and says the clearance is necessary for permitted, consented or otherwise legally established activity. In our very first hearing, we had some discussion and some legal submissions with regard to making reference to legally established activities, and just wondering in light of that whether the wording that is there is appropriate.
I'd probably need to refresh my memory on what those discussions were in the first hearing. That clause was developed probably to avoid listing a whole lot of activities that you know, would be associated with the clearance of vegetation to try and avoid you know, doubling up. But I'm happy to look into that discussion and maybe chat with Shelley in the break.
I guess a question for Mike Moore. If you can't see something, is there a visual impact?
No, there's not, but there could be a landscape impact.
And in part that flows from, I guess, Rule 7, and there's another bit in Rule 7 that talks about activities set back 100 metres from any side or rear boundary. We've had an evolution in thinking from the planners as to the way we describe boundaries, given that properties like that one up there are held in a number of titles and therefore have a number of side or rear boundaries. And I think it was heading towards a descriptor of side and rear property boundaries, not site boundaries. If you can just clarify that.
It's triggering something in my memory that Claire and I discussed, and I can't remember what it is. Do you want to, we'll maybe wait until Stony Creek presents, but there was a reason, but in theory I have no issue with that. Yeah.
And part 3 of that rule says the activity is not visual from a formed public road or other public viewpoint. In the rural chapter, quarrying has a setback of 50 metres from the boundary, not one of visibility. But is the logic that because this is a landscape area, although it's a lower sensitivity area, that should not be visible at all?
Yeah, it seems there's quite a lot of opportunity to find places that aren't visible in that area, and so it seemed a good thing to add in.
Can I follow on from that? I think. Just following on from that, I struggle to understand why the landscape issues are any less if you can't see them from a road. Is that something in legislation, or how is that view clarified?
There's still, I mean, there's the landscape effects and there's visual effects, and so if you can't see something, it could still have an effect. What's that, sorry?
Visual amenity, like we...
Sorry, I think what he's saying is landscape effects are sort of an umbrella term, and that what contributes to that are visual effects and are cultural effects, rather than saying it's a visual amenity landscape. That's sort of a separate issue. Landscape is informed by visual effects.
Sorry, I'm probably using landscape jargon here, but landscape values can be there whether you can see them, or whether you can see the place or not. But where you can see as well, that adds another level of significance perhaps as well. So, you know, just because you can't see something doesn't mean to say it isn't important. Yeah. Does that answer your question, sorry? Or? Yes. Yeah.
Can I turn to natural character for a moment? And the provisions we've got are focusing on waterways. How are natural character values outside of waterways considered in the plan?
Well, from my perspective, Mish probably needs to say something too, but the section 6, this natural character chapter is addressing section 6A, which is water. In terms of natural character comes into the landscape more generally, and so there's been an assessment of the whole district done by myself for landscape values, and we've ended up with, you know, a feature and an outstanding landscape, but the whole thing has been thought about in landscape terms as well. So, yeah.
I guess to build on what Mike's saying, you know, he did a district-wide assessment to see what areas were outstanding, whether landscape or features, and so did look at the entire district. Where they weren't found to be meeting those outstanding categories, the management of that defaults to the rest of the plan. So a lot of the provisions, they're not only considering natural character in general or landscape in general, but that does inform some of them. So minimum lot sizes, quarries, forestry, you know, those aren't the only reason those rules are there, but that's part of it holistically. Yeah.
do have a couple of questions on the way that some of the Ngāi Tahu cultural values, rights and interests are expressed in this chapter, but I'll hold those over to seeing the evidence that we're about to get on the way that this is dealt with across the whole plan and the consistency between.
Sorry, just to correct, do you mean in the next hearing stream? I mean, I'm happy for whatever changes there to be rolled out as consistent with this chapter, but yeah.
I guess for Mike Moore, when I look at the rule that deals with earthworks for new roads, farm tracks, etc., not being located within 30 metres of mapped ridge lines, the default for that rule is restricted discretionary. Is that strong enough, or do you think that farm tracks, walking and cycling tracks should be within 30 metres, either discretionary or non-complying?
As long as the matters of discretion are correct, then it should pick it up all right, I would have thought. And I think just direct me to the what is the rule, Mr.
Rule 3.
So you've got the effects of values listed in the appendix, and I've been very comfortable that picks up all the relevant things.
That was on purpose. You know, we anticipate there will be some sort of instances where, you know, Stony Creek or Wantwood might not be able to strictly adhere to those rules, and we don't want to, you know, have the bar set too high, provided that the values can be protected.
Just a question regarding the archaeological sites in the Hokonui Hills. It was a doc's suggestion on page 16. Is there a report on those sites, or are they recorded?
I think this is addressed through the earthworks chapter a little bit more in depth. There is an archaeological layer that does do that. I think the Hokonui Hills in general is identified on that. It doesn't get more specific in terms of sites because it's a little bit of unknown, but that's where that accidental discovery protocol comes in as being important. Though, as I said earlier, if the earthworks chapter then covers the Hokonui Hills anyway, then that's covered in the earthworks chapter. But yeah. No, I mean, it's just a bit unknown unless you dig up the entire Hokonui Hills to look for them, and I can't imagine Brett's advocating for that. Yeah.
I picked that up because it was a question I had been thinking about as well, because we've got a management regime that's coming through this chapter that's thinking about sensitivity, you know, something more can happen here because thinking about the landscape sensitivities, you know, there's a gradation. And then I guess when we get into the eco hearing, we'll be looking at more sensitive ecological sites and the way that works. And it did make me wonder that in relation to the archaeological, at the moment, the archaeological area is just an alert layer sitting outside the plan. And I did wonder if this idea of sensitivity might be a way to also think about the archaeological areas. Just this is an archaeologically sensitive area, and that might also have come into play as a way of approaching this specific area that's got a number of things going on. And we're clearly addressing the landscape matters and the ecological matters, but the historic heritage matters are sort of at the moment sort of sitting off to one side. And I wondered if that was a way.
I guess from the archaeological sensitivity, the lower sensitivity landscape areas haven't considered that. It's not suggesting those areas are lower from an archaeological perspective. It's only looking at landscape. I think if you were going to start managing that more directly, the most appropriate way to do that would be through the historical heritage chapter rather than the landscapes chapter, because otherwise you're suggesting that this area that's mapped is more important than any other in the district that's mapped. Yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Sorry, I wasn't suggesting that they would be managed under this chapter. I think when we had that hearing, the historic heritage hearing, we didn't have the benefit of what's flown out of the working group, and because the working group's been very focused on landscape and ecology, but hasn't thought about the historic heritage kind of stuff at the same time, now that we've got the product of that and it has introduced an idea of high sensitivity and low sensitivity in relation to this Section 6 matter, I guess what I'm asking is that mechanism, that planning mechanism, a potential way to also think about this other Section 6 matter, i.e. we could revisit what's come through the historic heritage hearing and this mechanism, like an alert layer might turn into a sensitivity layer for archaeology. Before we go any further, because I know that's not your jam, this is the landscapes hearing, but I guess what I'm letting you know is that we didn't have the benefit of the products of the working group output at the time we had that hearing. And I wondered if you could just, if you know, it would be helpful for me to know why the historic heritage and sort of cultural stuff was left out of the working group. Is that something that could be a collaborative matter going forward?
I'm going to jump in here if you don't mind. So there's two parts to the question. The second part around whether it was part of the working group, I'll hand back to Mishka for. But the first part of the question around treatment of historic heritage in this manner, it would probably require a little bit of work on our part to identify. It wasn't notified, so it would then need to revisit where there would be potentially scope to have that mechanism introduced without that notification providing it initially. So if that was something that panel was interested to look at, we could do that work, identify whether there was any scope available for using that mechanism, and then come back to you for that.
So I was seeing potential scope, which was one of the reasons I was asking the question, through the NZHPT submission. And I know that they're not here talking to us in this hearing because they were in the other hearing. But yeah, again, I think the thing here is that we know that we're talking about a defined area within the ONL that is being captured deliberately differently in relation to landscape and ecology, because it is a coherent whole with some specific parties impacted and some specific values already known, and being and then refining the provisions to reflect both the values and the working landscape. All of that seems eminently sensible, and it's just bothering me a little that we've got this other Section 6 matter that has been alerted through submissions. We've got some evidence sitting in front of us that there is a correlation in the same area, and and that it hasn't had the same benefit of the collaborative exercise to to help refine those provisions?
So the working group was formed as a direct result of the Stony Creek and a few other submissions specifically requesting a Hokonui Hills precinct. And I can't remember the exact wording, and Claire and Brett might clarify that later on. But yeah, I am not across the historical heritage submissions. However, I don't believe there was, as a directive submission, requesting a similar approach. But as I said, I'm not across those submissions, not being my topic, and so that then didn't fall out of that. Whereas, yeah, it was quite a directive submission from members of the community requesting this process in regards to the Hokonui Hills.
I'll just flag that at 10 o'clock we'll take a 15-minute break prior to 10:15, hearing from Transpower. I was looking further at Rule 6 that has a new clause you've recommended be added. The clearance complies with the Eco Rule 1 and Rule 2. Now, one of the things I'm struggling with the structure of the plan is that Rule 6 says non-compliance with that clause is a restricted discretionary activity. When you look at Eco Rule 1, some parts of it, when there's non-compliance, are discretionary. When you look at Rule 2, which deals with exotic weeds in the pest management plan, it's non-compliant. So I guess I'm hopeful as part of the wrap-up hearing that a more logical way of dealing with these, the status of not complying with rules and also the cross-referencing is dealt with in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so the development of that change to reference directly to the Eco Rule 1 and Rule 2 was to not, double up on eco clearance within the landscape chapter and just refer to that chapter. And the landscape architects sort of came to the conclusion that provided they were meeting those rules, the landscape effects were also considered suitable in terms of that permitted clearance. In terms of the difference in activity status, I do think this is more appropriate, and that landscape is only considering landscape effects. And it's not uncommon when you're going through a plan to, and this will probably come up with infrastructure as well. So say you're permitted in one chapter, but you've got triggers in another, or you've got an activity status in one and you've got a higher activity status there. You are considering different things, which warrants a different activity status. It's all bundled together in the one consent and addressed at the same time, but it does just sort of, I think, provides useful direction for plan users of what they're actually considering. So a restricted discretionary activity status, when you're breaching those rules in the landscape plan, I think is appropriate when you're considering, Appendix 5 and the impacts on Ngāi cultural values. It may be more appropriate in the eco chapter to have wider discretion to consider some other aspects. Matt can probably weigh in on that a little bit more in the eco chapter. If you wanted to raise the activity status because it's, say it's discretionary in the eco chapter and it's discretionary here, that's fine. But I do think where an RDIS activity status can be utilised, it is quite useful for plan users to kind of know exactly what they need to be considering in relation to landscape.
I guess from a style point of view, I don't have a problem if rule in one chapter says you need to comply with the standards in another chapter. I do struggle with having a rule that says you must also comply with another rule. And is there a better way then of, as part of the, in considering any consent in the eco chapter for those rules, of linking back to the policies and whatever of the NFL rules?
Sorry, are you suggesting deleting Rule 6 and just referencing back to our OBS and POLs within the eco chapter instead?
Rule 6.3, just the clearance complies with eco rules 1 and 2.
I guess you could delete rule clause 3 of rule 3 because the eco chapter will presumably have that anyway. However, I then want matters of discretion within the eco chapter to include reference to Appendix 5 and the impacts on Ngāi Tahu cultural values. They probably already have 2, but 1. So I think you'd need to make sure that if they were breaching rules 1 and 2 in the eco chapter, that they were still able to consider the impact on landscape values, which are listed in Appendix 5. So we just need a bit of rejigging. As long as the outcome is the same, I'm relaxed on how that happens.
And what you've just described, I think, in terms of the style of the plan, is the better way.
Sorry, just back on that. At the moment, the eco rule says, oh no, actually no, I think that's in Matt's report. We might need to do some rejigging of this during the eco chapter.
My watch says 10 o'clock, so we'll take a break until 10:15. Thank you.